He slept on bare oak planks, wore a shirt of thorns, and lived on scraps of bread. Yet, with a single stroke of his pen, he turned an entire kingdom into a theater of fire. They called him the Grand Savior, but his mercy smelled like burning flesh. Would you betray your own mother to escape his shadow? The cold stone walls of the monastery of St. Stephen in Salamanca hold a silence so heavy it seems to press against the very soul. Within this sanctuary of shadows, the air is thick with the scent of old parchment and cooling wax, yet it carries a sharper note of unwashed wool and drying blood. This is the domain of a man who has rejected the comforts of the world to embrace a narrow, agonizing path toward what he perceives as divine truth. Every flickering candle flame casts long, distorted shadows that dance across the uneven floor like restless spirits waiting for judgment. On the bare oak planks of a narrow cot lies a figure wrapped in a coarse hair shirt that scrapes against raw skin with every shallow breath. Tomas Torquemada does not seek the solace of sleep, for he considers the body an enemy to be conquered through relentless discipline and pain. His fingers, calloused and stained with ink, clutch a heavy wooden crucifix with a ferocity that speaks of a desperate, unyielding hunger for spiritual perfection. To him, the softness of a mattress is a gateway to sin, a temptation that must be crushed under the weight of a strictly enforced and punishing poverty. The rhythmic sound of a leather scourge striking flesh echoes through the small chamber, a private litany of suffering that marks the passage of the midnight hours. Fresh welts bloom across his back, crossing the scars of 1,000 previous nights, yet his face remains a mask of frozen determination. He believes that each drop of blood spilled in this cold room is a victory over the corruption of the flesh and a step closer to the light of the Creator. This self-inflicted agony is not a burden but a necessity, a cleansing fire that prepares his spirit for the task of purging an entire nation. His diet is as sparse as his surroundings, consisting of little more than hard crusts of bread and draughts of tepid water that barely sustain his gaunt frame. This calculated starvation sharpens his mind to a razor edge, stripping away the distractions of worldly hunger and replacing them with a singular, burning purpose. He looks upon the feasts of the nobility with a mixture of pity and profound disgust, seeing only the decay of the soul reflected in the indulgence of the gut. For Thomas, the true strength of a leader lies in the ability to deny oneself everything for the sake of absolute certainty. In the year 1483, the trajectory of this humble monk shifts irrevocably as he is elevated to the position of Grand Inquisitor of Castile and Aragon. The appointment by the Catholic monarchs is not merely a title but a divine mandate that transforms the walls of his monastery into the nerve center of a new and terrifying authority. He accepts this mantle with a heavy sense of destiny, convinced that the hand of the Almighty has reached down to guide his every decision. The transition from the shadows of a quiet cell to the center of power does not change his habits. He perceives himself as the shield of the faith, the gardener tasked with uprooting the weeds of heresy that threaten to choke the garden of the Church. The political landscape of Spain is a fractured mosaic of ancient kingdoms and diverse faiths, a reality that Torquemada views with a growing and obsessive dread. He believes that the survival of the crown and the salvation of the people depend entirely on a forced and absolute religious uniformity. This conviction becomes the foundation of his reign, a theological iron that he intends to use to brand the soul of the entire Iberian Peninsula. Standing before a large, hand-drawn map of Spain, his eyes trace the borders of the various regions with a cold and analytical precision that lacks any trace of human warmth. Each city and village marked on the parchment represents a potential hiding place for those who secretly practice forbidden rites under the guise of Christian devotion. His obsession with the concept of purity of blood begins to take root, turning his gaze toward the descendants of those who had converted from other faiths. He sees a hidden rot everywhere, a spiritual plague that requires a physician willing to use the knife. The silence of the monastery is no longer a place of peace but the quiet before a storm that will soon engulf the entire kingdom in a wave of fear and suspicion. Torquemada understands that to change the world, one must first be perceived as more than a man, as an embodiment of the law itself. His reputation for holiness and extreme austerity precedes him, creating an aura of invincibility that makes even the most powerful lords tremble in his presence. He does not seek love or even loyalty, only a terrified obedience that ensures the commands of the Holy Office are carried out. As the moon hangs low over the spires of Salamanca, the Grand Inquisitor remains awake, his mind already weaving the intricate web of edicts that will soon govern the lives of millions. He envisions a society where no secret is safe and no thought is hidden from the prying eyes of the faith, a kingdom of glass where every soul is laid bare. His belief that he is backed by the Creator grants him a terrifying sense of immunity from the moral constraints that bind ordinary men. In the darkness of his cell, the plan for a theater of horror is born, fueled by a devotion that lacks mercy. The flickering light of his single candle finally dies out, leaving him in a darkness that he finds more comforting than the day, for in the void, his vision of a purified Spain shines with intensity. He knows that the path ahead will be paved with the cries of the condemned and the smoke of countless pyres, yet he does not flinch from this realization. To him, the destruction of the body is a small price to pay for the preservation of the eternal soul. The monk who once sought only to vanish into the silence of God has now become the voice that will make the entire world scream. The royal audience hall in Córdoba is a cavern of shimmering gold and deep crimson velvet, yet the air within feels strangely thin and agitated. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand sit upon their elevated thrones, their heavy crowns catching the light from the tall stained-glass windows. Before them stands a man who seems to belong to another world entirely, his grey robes a stark, jarring contrast to the opulence of the court. Tomas Torquemada does not bow with the grace of a courtier but carries himself with the rigid certainty of a man who answers only to a higher power than any earthly sovereign. His voice is a low, persistent rasp that cuts through the whispers of the assembled nobles like a sharpened blade through silk. He speaks not of gold or territory, but of the invisible rot he believes is eating away at the foundations of the newly united Spanish crowns. For him, the reconquest of lands is meaningless if the souls of the people remain divided by conflicting beliefs and hidden loyalties. He argues that a kingdom with two hearts cannot survive, and that the only way to ensure the eternal favor of God is to forge a nation of a single, unyielding Catholic faith. The monarchs listen with a mixture of awe and growing trepidation as the monk unfolds his vision of a spiritual fortress. He introduces the terrifying concept of limpieza de sangre, the absolute purity of blood, as the new standard for Spanish identity. It is no longer enough to profess Christ, one must prove that no drop of ancestral deviance flows within their veins. This ideology transforms the very nature of citizenship, turning a person's lineage into a potential crime scene. The king and queen, burdened by the weight of their own ambition, begin to see his fanatical logic as a necessary tool. Torquemada paints a picture of a subterranean war being waged by those he calls the Judaizers, people who have converted to Christianity but secretly cling to their old traditions. He describes them as a cancer hiding in plain sight, infecting the social fabric of every city from Seville to Toledo. To the Grand Inquisitor, every act of mercy shown to these individuals is an act of treason against the Holy Mother Church. He demands the authority to seek out these hidden enemies, promising that once the chaff is burned away, the golden age of a holy Spain will finally begin to bloom. With the royal seal firmly behind him, Torquemada begins to construct a bureaucratic nightmare that will soon stretch its cold fingers into every corner of the land. He establishes the Holy Office not as a mere court, but as a silent, omnipresent predator that feeds on the whispers of the populace. The mechanism is designed to be self-sustaining, where the property of the accused is seized to fund the very machinery of their own destruction. This financial incentive ensures that the hunt for heretics will never lack for zeal or resources, creating a cycle of persecution that is impossible to stop. Throughout the winding streets of Spanish towns, the edicts of faith are read aloud by heralds whose voices carry the weight of a death sentence. These documents are not invitations to repentance but commands to betrayal, informing every citizen of their sacred duty to denounce their neighbors. The air in the plazas, once filled with the cheerful sounds of commerce, turns brittle and cold as the people realize the price of their survival. The edicts provide a detailed list of suspicious behaviors, turning the most mundane aspects of daily life into evidence of a spiritual transgression. The system thrives on the collapse of human trust, turning the dinner table and the hearth into places of profound danger. A wife watches her husband with newfound suspicion, wondering if his private prayers are as orthodox as his public ones. Children are taught that their primary loyalty belongs to the Church, even if it means delivering their own parents to the waiting hands of the Inquisitors. This erosion of the family unit is the ultimate victory for Torquemada, for a man who cannot trust his own kin has no choice but to throw himself at the feet of the institutional faith. The signs of heresy become a perverse science, studied and memorized by those who wish to prove their own zeal or settle ancient grudges. If a chimney does not smoke on a Saturday, it is noted by watchful eyes as a sign that the Sabbath is being observed in secret. If a woman is seen washing her clothes or changing her bed linens on a Friday evening, it is reported as a ritualistic preparation for a forbidden holy day. The very act of cleanliness becomes a mark of shame, a trail of breadcrumbs leading the inquisitors directly to the doors of the unsuspecting and the devout. Dietary habits are scrutinized with a frantic intensity that borders on the absurd, yet the consequences are tragically real. The refusal to eat pork or the careful removal of fat from a piece of meat is enough to trigger a formal investigation that can last for years. Neighbors count the number of times a family buys certain spices or how they prepare their vegetables, seeking any deviation from the standard Christian fare. Even the way a pot is scoured or the direction in which a bed is turned can be twisted into proof of a secret, ancient loyalty that the Church cannot tolerate. In the shadows of the evening, the figures in black cloaks begin their silent patrols, their presence a physical manifestation of the Grand Inquisitor's will. They move through the narrow alleys like ghosts, stopping before certain doors to deliver a summons that no one dares to ignore. The sound of a heavy wooden door being struck in the middle of the night becomes the most feared sound in Spain, a signal that a life has been effectively erased. Those who are taken are led away in a silence so profound it seems to swallow the very memory of their existence. The cities themselves begin to change, their architecture reflecting the psychological state of a population living under constant surveillance. Windows that once looked out onto the streets are shuttered and barred, and the lively courtyards where music once played are now quiet and empty. People walk with their heads bowed, avoiding eye contact with those they have known for a lifetime, fearing that a single glance might be misinterpreted. The labyrinthine streets of the old quarters become a trap, a maze where every turn could lead to an encounter with a familiar of the Holy Office. Torquemada watches from his fortified headquarters as his vision of a disciplined, fearful nation takes a solid and terrifying shape. He receives regular reports from his agents, reading through thousands of pages of denunciations with a clinical, detached interest. To him, these names are not human beings with dreams and fears, but merely data points in a grand spiritual accounting. He is pleased by the efficiency of the machine he has built, seeing the pervasive terror not as an evil, but as a necessary medicine for a soul that has wandered too far from the path. The Grand Inquisitor's paranoia is infectious, spreading from his cold monastery cell to the highest halls of the nobility and the lowest taverns of the ports. No one is considered too powerful or too pious to be beyond the reach of his scrutiny, creating a strange and terrible equality of fear. Bishops and generals find themselves looking over their shoulders, wondering if a stray word spoken in confidence years ago will return to haunt them. The entire social hierarchy is flattened by the realization that in the eyes of the Inquisition, every soul is equally suspect until proven otherwise. As the months turn into years, the culture of denunciation becomes a tool for personal gain, allowing the unscrupulous to eliminate rivals and seize their assets. A merchant who envies his competitor's success only needs to whisper a rumor of secret prayers to trigger a ruinous trial. A spurned lover or a disgruntled servant can wield the power of the Holy Office with a single well-placed lie, knowing that the burden of proof lies entirely with the accused. The law, intended to protect the faith, becomes a weapon used to settle petty grievances and satisfy the darkest of human impulses. Torquemada encourages this chaos, believing that the constant winnowing of society will eventually leave only the purest and most dedicated survivors. He views the suffering of the innocent as a minor inconvenience compared to the risk of allowing a single heretic to go unpunished. His logic is an iron cage from which there is no escape, a theological trap that justifies any cruelty in the name of a greater, divine good. He has turned the concept of Christian love into a terrifying obligation to destroy anything that does not fit his narrow, suffocating definition of the truth. The atmosphere of Spain becomes thick with the palpable tension of a society waiting for a blow that could fall at any moment. The bright Mediterranean sun seems to lose its warmth, and the vibrant colors of the landscape are muted by the grey presence of the inquisitors. Every conversation is guarded, every gesture is calculated, and every thought is censored before it can even be fully formed. This is the new Spain that Tomas Torquemada has wrought, a place where the only safety is found in total anonymity and the only peace is found in the complete surrender of the self. Deep within the archives of the Holy Office, the records of these betrayals are carefully preserved, creating a permanent memory of a nation's collective sin. Torquemada often wanders through these stacks of parchment, his fingers grazing the accounts of broken families and shattered lives. He sees in these records the map of a spiritual battlefield where he is the undisputed commander, leading his invisible army against the forces of darkness. For him, the terror is the evidence of his success, a sign that the people are finally learning to fear the consequences of their own hidden thoughts. The Grand Inquisitor's obsession with the purity of blood reaches a fever pitch as he begins to target the very aristocracy that supports the crown. He demands investigations into the lineages of the most ancient houses, searching for a single Jewish or Muslim ancestor who might have crossed into the Christian line centuries ago. This move creates a rift between the church and the nobility, but Torquemada remains unmoved by their protests or their pleas. He is convinced that the nobility's resistance is merely proof of their own hidden corruption, and he doubles his efforts to expose them. In the marketplaces, the once boisterous crowds now conduct their business in hushed tones, their eyes constantly scanning for the men in black. The simple act of buying or selling becomes a performative display of orthodoxy, where every interaction is infused with the need to appear beyond reproach. Merchants often refuse to serve those who have been even slightly tainted by suspicion, fearing that the association alone will be enough to bring the Inquisition to their own doorsteps. The economy of the country begins to suffer, but to Torquemada, the wealth of the soul is the only currency that matters. The psychological weight of this constant scrutiny begins to manifest in the physical health of the populace, leading to a strange and pervasive malaise. People grow thin and pale, their sleep plagued by nightmares of the dungeons that they know exist beneath their very feet. The joyous festivals that once defined Spanish life are replaced by somber processions and public penances, where the participants move like automatons. Torquemada looks upon this transformation and sees it as a beautiful, holy order, unaware that he has turned a vibrant kingdom into a sprawling, open-air prison of the mind. He remains convinced that his mission is a work of supreme compassion, a belief that allows him to sleep soundly while a nation weeps. The Grand Inquisitor is a man who has replaced his own heart with a stone tablet of laws, and he expects everyone else to do the same. His paranoia has become the national policy, a dark and suffocating cloud that hangs over the mountains and the plains, casting a shadow that will not be lifted for centuries. In his pursuit of a perfect, unified faith, he has succeeded only in creating a world where no one, not even the most pious, can ever truly feel safe. The final irony of his reign of terror is that the very unity he seeks is built upon a foundation of absolute fragmentation. By encouraging every citizen to be a spy and every child to be an informer, he has destroyed the social bonds that make a true nation possible. Spain is no longer a collection of people, but a collection of isolated individuals, each one a prisoner of their own fear in the watchful eyes of their neighbors. Torquemada stands at the center of this web, a master weaver who has forgotten that he too is caught in the strands of the very fear he has so carefully cultivated. Beneath the heavy stone foundations of the castles and cathedrals of Spain, a world exists where the sun never reaches and the air is thick with the stagnant damp of the earth. In these deep, lightless vaults, the passage of hours and days ceases to have any meaning, replaced by a rhythmic cycle of agony and hollow silence. The walls are slick with moisture that drips like slow, rhythmic tears into puddles of filth, reflecting only the dim, flickering light of oil lamps that cast monstrous shadows against the cold granite. This is the kingdom of the Holy Office, a place where time itself is suspended in a state of eternal, breathless anticipation. The architects of this subterranean hell do not view themselves as monsters or executioners, but as the humble servants of a divine and terrifying love. They believe that the human body is merely a temporary vessel, a stubborn cage of bone and muscle that often traps the soul in a web of deceit and heresy. To them, the infliction of pain is a surgical necessity, a ritualistic breaking of the physical form intended to release the truth that lies buried deep within the conscience. There are no judges here in the traditional sense, only spiritual doctors who use the language of iron and fire to speak to the silent, trembling spirit. Tomas Torquemada sits in his well-lit study far above these dungeons, his quill scratching tirelessly across sheets of fine parchment as he codifies the laws of suffering. He is a man of meticulous detail, personally drafting the instructions that dictate exactly how a body should be handled to maximize spiritual output without causing premature death. His writings are cold and clinical, stripping away the visceral horror of the process and replacing it with a structured, theological framework. He insists that every groan and every whispered confession be recorded with absolute precision, for in his mind, these are the echoes of a soul returning to God. The Grand Inquisitor's manuals are filled with the logic of the extreme, arguing that the more the flesh suffers, the more the spirit is purified and made ready for the light of heaven. He views the instruments of the dungeon not as weapons of cruelty, but as tools of a profound and agonizing mercy that prevents the eternal fires of hell. This twisted philosophy becomes the guiding principle for the men in the shadows, who approach their grim tasks with the solemnity of priests performing a sacred mass. In this upside-down world, the scream of a victim is heard as a prayer, and the smell of burning skin is interpreted as a holy incense. One of the most favored devices in these dark halls is the potro, a wooden rack where the accused is bound by thin, biting cords that cut deep into the flesh. As the inquisitors turn the iron cranks, the sound of stretching tendons and popping joints fills the room, a dry and brittle noise that seems to vibrate through the very stones. The victim is encouraged to look upon their own destruction and see it as a reflection of the spiritual decay they have allowed to take root in their hearts. Every inch of movement is a question, a demand for the name of a hidden accomplice or the admission of a secret, forbidden rite. The water torture, known as the taka, is a slower and more insidious form of violation that leaves no marks on the skin but shatters the mind with the sensation of drowning. A cloth is forced into the throat of the accused, and water is poured slowly over it, creating a suffocating barrier that prevents the intake of air. The victim struggles against an invisible sea, their eyes bulging in the dim light as they experience the terror of a death that never quite arrives. This process is designed to mimic the feeling of being swallowed by the abyss, forcing the soul to surrender its secrets just to catch one more jagged, gasping breath. Throughout these ordeals, a scribe sits in the corner, his pen moving in perfect synchronization with the rhythmic gasps of the interrogated. He captures every nuance of the performance, noting the exact moment a person breaks and the specific words they use to beg for an end to the torment. These documents are not merely legal records but are considered holy relics of the struggle against the darkness, evidence that the machinery of the faith is functioning as intended. The coldness of the ink on the page stands in sharp contrast to the warmth of the blood that often spills onto the cold, unforgiving floor of the cell. Torquemada remains convinced that the truth obtained through these methods is the only truth that matters, regardless of whether it was birthed from genuine conviction or the sheer desire for the pain to stop. He dismisses the idea that a person might lie to save themselves from the rack, believing instead that the Holy Spirit would not allow a false confession to stand in the way of a true cleansing. His faith in the system he has created is absolute, a fortress of certainty that protects him from the cries of the thousands who pass through the gates of the Inquisition. To him, the broken bodies are a small price for a unified kingdom. As the number of the condemned grows into the thousands, the atmosphere of the Spanish cities begins to change, taking on the heavy, oppressive character of the dungeons themselves. The grand plazas that were once the heart of public life are now the stages for the final acts of this spiritual drama, where the smell of wood smoke becomes a permanent fixture of the air. This is not the clean smell of a hearth fire, but a thick, greasy odor that clings to the clothes and hair of every passerby. It is the smell of a society being burned away at the edges, a constant reminder that the eyes of the Holy Office are always watching. On the days of the great public burnings, a profound and heavy silence falls over the streets, a quiet so intense that even the birds seem to stop their singing. The people gather in the squares not out of a desire for spectacle, but because their absence would be noted as a sign of sympathy for the heretics. They stand in long, motionless rows, their faces hooded and their eyes cast downward, afraid that a single stray glance might betray their inner thoughts to the familiars of the Inquisition. The air is thick with a tension that feels like a physical weight, pressing the breath out of the lungs of the entire community. In this atmosphere of pervasive fear, the only sound that breaks the stillness is the soft, frantic whispering of prayers from those who still hope to remain unnoticed by the black-cloaked officials. These prayers are not for the souls of the dying, but for the safety of the living, a desperate plea to be overlooked by the machine of the faith. Friends and neighbors who have known each other for decades now stand side by side as strangers, each one terrified that the person next to them might be an informer. The social fabric of the city is not just torn, it is being meticulously unraveled by the very hands that claim to be protecting it. The architecture of the city squares is transformed into a landscape of terror, dominated by the massive wooden pyres that wait like hungry beasts for their next meal. The construction of these structures is a public event in itself, a slow and deliberate process that serves as a warning to all who watch. The sound of hammers hitting nails echoes through the alleys, a repetitive and rhythmic counting down of the hours left for those currently languishing in the cells below. Each piece of timber added to the pile is a testament to the inexorable nature of Torquemada's justice, a fire that cannot be quenched until the land is pure. Those who are led out from the dungeons to face the fire are often unrecognizable as human beings, their bodies twisted and their spirits hollowed out by months of darkness and systematic abuse. They wear the sambenito, the yellow tunic of the penitent, adorned with painted flames and leaping demons that announce their crimes to the world. These figures stumble through the streets in a daze, their feet bare and bleeding on the rough cobblestones, guided by the firm hands of monks who whisper words of final, cold comfort. To the crowd, they are no longer people, but living symbols of the consequences of straying from the narrow path. As the torches are applied to the base of the pyres, the silence of the square is finally broken by the crackling of the dry wood and the sudden, violent roar of the rising flames. The heat becomes an invisible wall that pushes the front ranks of the crowd back, forcing them to shield their eyes from the blinding light of the execution. The smoke rises in great, black plumes that blot out the sun, turning the bright Spanish day into a premature and artificial night. In this darkness, the boundaries between the world of the living and the world of the dead seem to blur, leaving only the heat and the screams. The emotional toll on the observers is a form of torture in itself, a psychological scarring that will pass down through the generations like a dark inheritance. They watch as people they once broke bread with are consumed by the fire, forced to witness the physical reality of the Grand Inquisitor's theology. Some people faint from the intensity of the scene, while others stand frozen in a state of catatonic shock, their minds unable to process the level of calculated cruelty unfolding before them. The terror is not just in the death itself, but in the realization that this is the new moral order of their world. Tomas Torquemada does not attend every burning, but he feels the heat of the fires in his soul, viewing each one as a successful step in his divine mission. He believes that the smoke rising from the plazas of Spain is a sweet-smelling sacrifice to the Lord, a sign that the land is finally being purged of the ancient filth that has long defiled it. His satisfaction is not a personal one, but a cold, ideological triumph over the forces of diversity and hidden thought. He remains in his cell, his hands clean of the ash but his mind forever occupied by the logistics of the next great purification. The shadow of the Inquisition stretches far beyond the city limits, reaching into the smallest mountain villages and the most remote coastal settlements. No corner of the kingdom is too small to escape the reach of the Holy Office, and no person is too insignificant to be spared the scrutiny of the Grand Inquisitor. The fear of the dungeon becomes a permanent part of the Spanish psyche, a silent specter that sits at every table and follows every traveler on the road. The very concept of privacy dies, replaced by a transparency that is enforced through the threat of the rack and the promise of the flame. As the years of 1480 and 1490 progress, the dungeons become more crowded, and the machinery of death becomes more efficient and more frequent. The initial shock of the persecutions is replaced by a weary, soul-crushing acceptance, as the population adapts to living in a state of perpetual mourning. The vibrant culture of medieval Spain, once a crossroads of civilizations, is being systematically erased and replaced by a monotonous and terrified conformity. The Grand Inquisitor has succeeded in turning the entire country into a reflection of his own dark and narrow cell, where only the suffering is truly real. The final irony of these deep vaults is that they do not just hold the enemies of the faith, but they also imprison the inquisitors themselves, who are trapped in a cycle of suspicion that can never be satisfied. They spend their lives surrounded by pain and lies, their own souls becoming as cold and hard as the instruments they wield with such practiced ease. In their quest to save others, they have lost the ability to feel anything but the grim satisfaction of a completed task. The darkness of the dungeons has seeped into their very marrow, turning them into extensions of the stone and iron that define their existence. Outside, the wind carries the ash of the day's executions across the rooftops, settling in the cracks of the walls and the folds of the clothing of the citizens. It is a fine, gray dust that covers everything, a physical manifestation of the reach of the Holy Office that cannot be washed away or ignored. The people of Spain walk through this rain of ash with their mouths closed and their eyes averted, living in a world where even the air they breathe is a reminder of the price of their survival. The fire of Torquemada continues to burn, a relentless light that reveals everything and warms absolutely no one. The year 1492 arrives with a cold, triumphant wind that sweeps through the newly conquered streets of Granada. The last stronghold of the Moors has finally fallen, and the air is thick with the scent of victory and the sound of Christian bells ringing from minarets that have been hastily turned into bell towers. For the Grand Inquisitor, this is not merely a military triumph but a divine signal that the time for total spiritual consolidation has arrived. He walks through the halls of the Alhambra, his humble robes dragging across the intricate tiles, seeing only a desperate need to scrub the land clean of its diverse and ancient history. Torquemada moves like a shadow through the shimmering corridors of the Moorish palace, his presence a jarring contrast to the delicate geometry of the walls. He perceives the victory of the Catholic monarchs as an incomplete miracle, a foundation that requires a final, brutal layer of architectural purity. To him, the presence of those who do not share the cross is a lingering stain on the honor of the crown and a threat to the stability of the realm. He begins to whisper into the ears of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, weaving a narrative where the internal enemy is far more dangerous than the armies they have just defeated in the field of battle. The Jewish community, sensing the rising tide of hostility, gathers their most respected leaders to seek a desperate audience with the sovereigns. They have lived on this soil for over 1,000 years, contributing to the wealth, science, and philosophy of the peninsula, and they cannot believe that their service will be forgotten. They offer a staggering sum of 30,000 gold ducats to help the crown pay off the massive debts incurred during the long war against Granada. It is a gesture of loyalty, a plea for the right to exist in the only home they have ever known, and the monarchs, burdened by costs, begin to hesitate at the sight of the gold. Inside the royal chamber, the atmosphere is heavy with the glint of the precious metal and the silent calculations of the king. Ferdinand and Isabella look upon the treasure, their resolve softening as they consider the practical needs of their expanding empire. But the door bursts open with a violence that shatters the diplomatic silence, and Tomas Torquemada strides toward the table with his eyes burning like cold coals. He does not see gold, he sees a repeat of the most infamous betrayal in the history of the world. He reaches into the folds of his habit, his fingers trembling with a mixture of righteous anger and calculated, theatrical fury. The Grand Inquisitor raises a heavy wooden crucifix high above his head before slamming it down onto the table, right in the center of the piled gold coins. The sound of wood hitting metal echoes like a thunderclap through the vaulted room, silencing every heartbeat. He stares directly at the monarchs, his voice trembling with a terrifying intensity as he accuses them of preparing to sell their savior for a second time. He invokes the image of Judas Iscariot and the 30 pieces of silver, casting the kings as traitors to the very faith that granted them their victory. The gold suddenly looks like lead in the eyes of the terrified and humiliated sovereigns. Shame and religious dread wash over the royal couple as they look from the crucifix to the man who claims to hold the keys to their eternal salvation. The influence of Torquemada is absolute in this moment, a spiritual stranglehold that bypasses all economic or political logic. He demands nothing less than the total expulsion of every Jew who refuses to accept the waters of baptism, framing it as the only way to save the Spanish soul from divine wrath. The monarchs, paralyzed by the fear of excommunication and the loss of God's favor, reach for the quill to sign the document that will change the face of their kingdom forever. The Alhambra decree is signed in the spring of 1492, a few strokes of ink that effectively erase the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. The edict gives the Jewish population exactly 4 months to sell their belongings and depart the kingdom, forbidden from taking any gold, silver, or minted coins with them. It is a sentence of wandering and poverty imposed upon families who have been part of the Spanish fabric for generations. Torquemada watches the proclamation being read in the plazas, his face a mask of iron satisfaction, believing he has finally performed the ultimate surgery on the body of the state. As the deadline approaches in the heat of July, the roads of Spain become rivers of human misery and desperate, hurried movement. Families are seen dragging carts filled with the few possessions they are allowed to keep, leaving behind grand houses and ancestral graves for the uncertainty of the sea. They are forced to trade their valuable properties for mere trinkets or livestock, as the local population takes advantage of their desperate situation. The Grand Inquisitor views this mass exodus not as a tragedy of human suffering, but as a holy cleansing, a necessary purging of the land that he has sworn to deliver to God in a state of absolute, unyielding grace. In the ports of the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, the air is filled with the cries of the departing, who look back at the receding shoreline with a grief that transcends words. Many will perish from disease, starvation, or the blades of pirates, but Torquemada remains unmoved by the reports of the mounting death toll. To him, these lives are irrelevant compared to the purity of the faith he is building within the borders of Spain. He has succeeded in creating a vacuum of culture and intellect, but in his eyes, he has replaced it with the solid, unbreakable stone of religious uniformity that no earthly force can ever hope to challenge. While the exiles flee, the cities of Spain prepare for a different kind of spectacle, the grandest and most terrifying auto-da-fe ceremonies yet seen. These acts of faith are designed to be grand theatrical performances that reinforce the power of the Inquisition over the hearts of the remaining population. The main plazas are transformed into massive outdoor cathedrals, with tiered seating for the nobility and a central platform for the condemned. Every detail is meticulously planned by Torquemada to ensure that the message of divine justice is delivered with maximum psychological impact. The atmosphere is one of hysterical piety and a deep, underlying dread. On the morning of the execution, the bells of the cathedrals begin a slow, rhythmic tolling that vibrates in the chests of everyone in the city. The condemned are led from their cells, their bodies weakened by months of torture and darkness, now thrust into the blinding light of the Spanish sun. They are dressed in the sanbenitos, the coarse yellow tunics that mark them as enemies of the cross. Painted upon the fabric are scenes of writhing demons and leaping flames, a visual prophecy of the fate that awaits them. They carry unlit green candles in their trembling hands, moving like ghosts through a world that has already decided to forget them. The procession winds through the streets, lined with crowds that have been taught to hate these people as the source of all their worldly misfortunes. Some onlookers throw stones or spit upon the prisoners, while others watch in a catatonic silence, terrified that any sign of pity might be interpreted as a sign of their own secret heresy. The Grand Inquisitor walks at the head of the religious officials, his posture as straight as a spear, his eyes fixed forward. He does not look at the individuals behind him, he only sees the abstract concept of error being led to the altar of truth for a final and irrevocable correction. Upon reaching the plaza, the sentences are read aloud in a grueling process that lasts for hours under the sweltering heat. The legal language is interspersed with long, fiery sermons that emphasize the infinite mercy of the Church in allowing these souls to be purged by fire before they meet the eternal flames of the abyss. Torquemada sits on an elevated throne, overlooking the entire scene with a clinical, detached intensity. He watches as the condemned are handed over to the secular authorities, a bureaucratic sleight of hand that allows the Church to claim it has shed no blood while ensuring the death of the prisoners. The transition to the burning grounds, the quemadero, is a frantic and chaotic march as the sun begins to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the landscape. The wooden pyres are stacked high with dry timber and brush, designed to catch quickly and burn with an intense, suffocating heat. The condemned are tied to the stakes, their yellow robes fluttering in the evening breeze as the torches are brought forward by the executioners. There is a final moment of absolute silence, a breath held by an entire nation, before the first sparks find their mark and the base of the wood begins to glow with a hungry, orange light. As the flames begin to climb the stakes, the air is filled with a roar that drowns out the prayers and the final, desperate cries of the dying. The heat becomes a physical barrier, forcing the guards to step back, yet Torquemada remains in his place of honor, his eyes unblinking as they reflect the growing inferno. He watches the yellow fabric of the Sanbenitos disappear into the black smoke, seeing it as the final dissolution of the corruption that had plagued his vision of Spain. To him, the agony of the moment is a fleeting discomfort compared to the eternal salvation he believes he is securing for the kingdom. The Grand Inquisitor truly believes that the fire is an act of supreme mercy, a temporal pain that prevents the infinite suffering of the soul in the afterlife. He watches the faces of the condemned as they are lost to the light, his heart hardened by a theological certainty that leaves no room for human empathy or doubt. He imagines that at the moment of death, the spirit is finally stripped of its lies and returned to a state of purity, even if only for a fraction of a second before it meets its maker. This conviction is the shield that protects him from the horror of his own actions, turning a massacre into a liturgy. The smoke from the pyres rises in a thick, greasy column that blots out the stars, settling over the city like a heavy, dark shroud. It carries the ash of human lives into the lungs of the spectators, a physical communion of terror that will haunt their dreams for years to come. The smell of the burning remains in the streets long after the fires have cooled, a persistent reminder of the price of deviation. Torquemada breathes in this air with a sense of accomplishment, his lungs untroubled by the soot or the scent of death. For him, the air is finally clean because the voices of dissent have been silenced. In the aftermath of the Great Purge of 1492, the social landscape of Spain is irrevocably altered, leaving behind a hollowed-out shell of its former self. The vibrant intellectual life of the Jewish quarters is gone, replaced by a suspicious and fearful silence that discourages any form of inquiry or independent thought. The wealth and knowledge that had once made the peninsula a beacon of light in the Middle Ages are sacrificed on the altar of a singular, narrow identity. The Grand Inquisitor has won his war against the past, but in doing so, he has condemned the future of his country to a long and dark isolation. The monarchs sit in their palace, surrounded by the gold they eventually seized from those who could not flee, yet they find little comfort in their new, purified realm. They have handed the soul of their government over to a man who recognizes no authority but his own interpretation of the divine will. The fear that Torquemada used to coerce them into signing the edict now permeates every level of their administration, turning their triumph into a prison of their own making. They are the rulers of a land of shadows, where the only thing more certain than the law is the reach of the Holy Office. Torquemada returns to his cell at the end of the year, his body weary but his mind ablaze with the success of his mission. He has seen the cross raised over the Alhambra and the enemies of his faith scattered to the corners of the earth or reduced to ash in the plazas. He views the year 1492 as the zenith of his life, the moment when the earthly and divine realms perfectly aligned under his direction. He lays down on his bare wooden planks, the smell of the smoke still clinging to his grey robes, and closes his eyes in a state of profound and terrifying peace. As the final years of the 15th century descend upon the mountains of Castile, the monk finds that time is a more relentless adversary than any secret heretic. Tomas Torquemada, once a figure of indomitable energy, now moves with a slow and painful deliberation that belies the fire still burning in his eyes. His body has become a fragile shell of bone and sinew, yet his spirit refuses to surrender to the frailty of old age. His waning strength is redirected into an all-consuming suspicion that transforms every shadow into a lurking assassin. He no longer seeks the peace of the cloister, for peace has become a luxury he cannot afford in a world he perceives as teeming with hidden, invisible enemies. The quiet sanctity of the monastic life has been replaced by the jarring, rhythmic clatter of iron and the heavy tread of soldiers. Wherever the Grand Inquisitor walks, he is surrounded by a formidable retinue of 200 cavalrymen, their steel breastplates reflecting the harsh sun of the high plateau. These horsemen are his living shield, a wall of muscle and weaponry designed to keep the vengeful world at a distance. Their presence turns the narrow corridors of his residence into a military encampment, where the clink of spurs and the rattle of sabers provide a constant, violent accompaniment to his whispered prayers. He trusts only the steel that protects him from the people he has spent a lifetime judging. In addition to the mounted guard, 50 infantrymen armed with heavy halberds stand at every doorway and march behind him in a phalanx of grim protection. These men are handpicked for their unwavering loyalty and their lack of pity, serving as the final barrier between the aging prelate and the daggers he imagines in every hand. The monastery, once a place of silent meditation, now vibrates with the heavy energy of a garrison under siege. Torquemada moves through this forest of spears with a rigid posture, his hands tucked into his sleeves, looking at his own protectors with a gaze that searches for the slightest sign of hesitation or trepidation. He is a master of fear who has finally become its most dedicated student. His retreat to the monastery of St. Thomas in Avila marks the final stage of his withdrawal from a world he no longer recognizes as holy. This massive stone structure, which he helped to build with the spoils of his office, is transformed into a sovereign fortress perched on the edge of the Spanish soul. The thick walls and narrow windows are designed to exclude the light of the outside world, creating an interior landscape of gray stone and deep, impenetrable shadows. Within this bastion, the Grand Inquisitor rules over a kingdom of silence and steel, convinced that only through such absolute isolation can he protect the purity of his mission from the corrupting influence of the profane. On the heavy oak table where he conducts his grim business, there sits a singular object that serves as a testament to his mounting dread. A long, ivory-white horn of a legendary unicorn, which is in reality the tusk of a narwhal, is never far from his reach. In the superstitions of the late 1400s, this rare relic is believed to possess the divine power to reveal the presence of venom by sweating or changing its hue. Before a single morsel of bread or a drop of water is allowed to touch his lips, the horn is brought forth to skin the vessels, a silent and desperate ritual of survival that precedes every meal. He eats with the caution of a man who expects his next breath to be his last. The kitchens of the monastery are placed under a scrutiny so intense it rivals the interrogation of a high-ranking heretic. Every servant who handles his food is watched by armed guards, and the preparation of his meager meals is a process of fearful precision. Torquemada views the act of eating not as a source of nourishment but as a moment of profound vulnerability, a gap in his armor where a clever enemy might strike. He has lost the ability to taste the bread or the herbs, for his tongue is only searching for the metallic tang of arsenic or the bitter hint of hemlock. His diet of austerity is now fueled by the bitter calories of a deep and incurable paranoia. Sleep, when it comes, is no longer a period of rest but a shorter and more troubled passage through a landscape of dark portents. He continues to reject the comfort of a mattress, lying instead on the bare, cold boards that have supported his frame for decades. As his bones grow thin and his skin becomes like dry parchment, the hardness of the wood becomes a source of constant, dull pain that he welcomes as a penance. He stares at the ceiling in the small hours of the night, listening to the footsteps of the sentries outside his door, wondering if they are his protectors or the heralds of his downfall. The silence of the night is a canvas upon which his mind paints the faces of those he sent to the fire. In these long, sleepless vigils, he is haunted by the idea that his work is fundamentally unfinished and that the enemies of the faith are more resilient than he anticipated. He envisions secret meetings in the cellars of the cities he purified, where the children of the exiles plot their return and their revenge. His mind obsessively circles the concept of the hidden convert, the Marrano who wears the cross but harbors the old laws in the secret chambers of the heart. To Torquemada, the existence of a single drop of impure blood in the veins of a Spanish noble is a crack in the foundation of the entire church, a rot that must be hunted down with a renewed and frantic intensity. From his fortress in Avila, he continues to exert a cold and heavy influence over the royal court, sending a constant stream of letters to Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. His messages are no longer filled with the triumph of the reconquest but are instead dark warnings against the dangers of leniency and the spread of new, dangerous ideas. He scolds the monarchs for any perceived weakness in their resolve, demanding that the search for hidden heretics be expanded into the very ranks of the clergy and the aristocracy. He views himself as the only one with the courage to see the truth, standing alone against a rising tide of compromise and spiritual decay that threatens to undo his life's work. The theological madness that has consumed him now focuses on the minute details of lineage and the invisible stain of ancestry. He argues that the purity of blood is not merely a social requirement but a divine necessity, a physical manifestation of a soul's worthiness before the Creator. This obsession leads him to demand the creation of vast archives where the histories of every family are recorded and scrutinized for any hint of deviation. He wants to turn the history of Spain into a ledger of sins and bloodlines, where every individual is defined by the choices of their ancestors 4 generations removed. In his eyes, the past is a prison from which no one can truly escape. The physical pain of his gout and the worsening condition of his legs are viewed by the Grand Inquisitor as a spiritual crucible, a final test of his devotion. He refuses all but the most basic medical care, believing that the suffering of his body is a necessary bridge to the suffering of the Savior. He hobbles through the cloisters on a heavy wooden staff, each step a testament to his willpower and his rejection of the flesh. The soldiers who watch him pass are struck by the sight of this frail, bent figure who still commands the power to destroy lives with a single movement of his hand. He is a ghost who refuses to leave the stage until the final act of the drama is played out. Along the walls of the monastery of St. Thomas, he has ordered the hanging of the Sanbenitos, the yellow tunics of those who were reconciled or executed by the Holy Office. These garments, fading and covered in dust, serve as a macabre gallery of his achievements and a warning to the monks who dwell within the walls. He walks past them in the twilight, his fingers sometimes grazing the coarse fabric, recalling the names and the crimes associated with each one. These are his trophies, the pelts of the wolves he hunted in the name of the Lamb, and they provide him with the only sense of satisfaction he is still capable of feeling in his isolation. The atmosphere within the monastery is one of stifling, suffocating tension, where the monks move in a state of perpetual anxiety under the watchful eyes of the guards. They speak in whispers, if they speak at all, fearing that a single misplaced word might be interpreted as a sign of sympathy for the Grand Inquisitor's enemies. The religious services are conducted with a somber, military precision, where the beauty of the chant is overshadowed by the presence of armed men in the nave. Torquemada has succeeded in turning the house of God into a reflection of his own soul, a place where the presence of the divine is synonymous with the presence of an absolute and terrifying judgment. As the months of 1498 approach, he begins to feel that he is being watched not only by his enemies but by the very guards he hired to protect him. He notices the way the younger soldiers look at him, with a mixture of revulsion and awe, and he wonders if their loyalty can truly be bought with gold or if it is as fragile as the glass in his windows. He changes his sleeping quarters without notice and refuses to drink from any cup that has not been tasted by a subordinate in his presence. The circle of his trust has shrunk until it contains only himself, and even then, he questions the reliability of his own failing senses. The reports from Rome suggest that even the Pope is beginning to grow weary of the Grand Inquisitor's unrelenting zeal and has sent legates to moderate his authority. Torquemada receives these representatives with a cold, formal hostility, viewing them as interlopers who do not understand the unique spiritual struggle of the Spanish people. He dismisses their calls for mercy as the talk of men who have forgotten the true cost of salvation. He remains defiant, convinced that his mandate comes from a higher source than any earthly office, and he continues to operate the machinery of the Inquisition with a stubborn and solitary independence that borders on open rebellion. The cold winds of Avila, which howl across the stone ramparts and through the unheated halls of the monastery, seem to echo the internal landscape of his heart. He welcomes the chill, seeing it as a cleansing force that strips away the vanity and warmth of the human world. He sits for hours in the drafty chapel, his hands blue with cold, staring at the altar with a gaze that expects no comfort and asks for no relief. To him, the cold is the state of the universe without the light of the true faith, and he sees it as his duty to be the keeper of the only fire that matters, even if it consumes everything in its path. He has effectively walled himself in, both physically and psychologically, creating a reality where the only thing that exists is the battle between his will and the encroaching darkness. He has no friends, no confidants, and no heirs to his vision, only a collection of documents and a reputation that has become a synonym for terror. He looks out over the walls of Avila at the vast, empty landscape of Castile, seeing it not as a country of people but as a battlefield of spirits. His isolation is the ultimate victory of his paranoia, a state of perfect, lonely purity where he is finally safe because he is entirely alone. The Grand Inquisitor's final obsession remains the unfinished business of the hunt, the nagging suspicion that the most dangerous enemies are those who have not yet been named. He spends his remaining energy reviewing old cases and searching for patterns of betrayal that he might have missed in the decades of his reign. He is a man who cannot allow the fire to go out, for he fears that the darkness will rush back in the moment he closes his eyes. In his mind, the purge must continue forever, a perpetual cycle of blood and fire that is the only way to keep the world from falling into the hands of the great deceiver. In the quietude of September, 1498, the air within the monastery of St. Thomas in Avila grew thin and stagnant. The relentless heat of the Spanish summer had begun to fade, replaced by a biting autumn chill that seeped through the thick granite walls. Inside his cell, the man who had reshaped a kingdom with fire and iron lay motionless, his breathing a shallow rasp that barely disturbed the heavy silence. To those who watched from the shadows, he seemed less a man and more a piece of weathered ivory, carved by decades of self-inflicted pain and unyielding, fanatical devotion. The scent of incense hung heavy in the room, a thick, cloying fog intended to mask the odor of mortality and sanctify the departure of a servant of God. Tomas Torquemada remained convinced of his own righteousness, his mind a fortress of certainty even as his physical senses began to fail. He saw no faces of the thousands he had condemned, only the bright, blinding light of a divine mission he believed he had fulfilled to the letter of the law. In his final hours, he felt the cold grip of death not as a punishment, but as the ultimate reward for a life spent purging the earth of what he deemed spiritual filth. On the 16th day of September, 1498, the heart of the Grand Inquisitor finally ceased its rhythmic labor. There were no celestial signs or dramatic storms, only the abrupt cessation of a breath that had once held the power to command the lives and deaths of an entire nation. The monks who surrounded his bed moved with a practiced, terrified grace, their prayers rising in a monotonous chant that filled the stone chamber. They looked upon the gaunt, frozen features of the man who had been the architect of Spain's terror, wondering if the peace he had finally found was the same peace he had denied to so many others. He was laid to rest within the hallowed ground of the monastery he had built, his body encased in a tomb of stone that was meant to endure until the end of time. For decades, and then centuries, the name of Torquemada remained a dark talisman, whispered with a mixture of reverence by the devout and absolute dread by the descendants of his victims. His grave was a silent monument to the power of the Holy Office, a place where the shadows seemed deeper and the air colder than in the rest of the cathedral. He rested in the absolute purity he had craved, isolated from the world by layers of blessed rock and the enduring legacy of his own terrifying name. The centuries rolled over Spain like a slow, heavy tide, bringing with them the winds of change that the Grand Inquisitor would have recognized as the ultimate heresy. The era of the Enlightenment began to peel away the layers of religious secrecy, exposing the mechanisms of the Inquisition to the harsh light of reason and human rights. The memory of Torquemada, once protected by the armor of the Church, began to transform into a symbol of institutional cruelty and the madness of unchecked zeal. The fear that had once paralyzed the populace was slowly being replaced by a simmering, ancestral resentment that waited for the right moment to ignite. In the year 1832, the political foundations of the country began to tremble under the weight of civil unrest and the dismantling of the old monastic orders. The once sacred walls of the monastery in Avila were no longer viewed as a refuge of the holy, but as the fortresses of an oppressive past that had held the nation in a suffocating grip. The air in the streets of Spain was thick with the rhetoric of liberty and the cries of those who sought to settle old accounts with history. The silence of the Grand Inquisitor's tomb was soon to be broken by a sound he had never anticipated, the roar of a mob that had lost its fear of the divine. A wave of rioters, fueled by the chaos of the First Carlist War and the suppression of the religious houses, converged upon the gates of the monastery of St. Thomas. They did not come for the gold or the relics, but for the men whose shadow had haunted their collective memory for 300 years. With sledgehammers and iron bars, they struck the heavy stone doors, the rhythmic pounding echoing through the cloisters like the ghost of the Grand Inquisitor's own scourge. The monks had fled, leaving the sanctuary to the mercy of a crowd that had none to give, their faces twisted with a fury that mirrored the very intolerance Torquemada had once championed. The heavy slab of the sarcophagus was pried loose with a screech of tortured stone, revealing the dark cavity where the remains of the great Inquisitor had rested in supposed sanctity. The crowd surged forward, their torches casting a flickering, orange light into the depths of the tomb, illuminating the brittle bones and the remnants of the shrouds. There was no majesty in the sight, only the pathetic reality of human decay that the man had spent his life trying to transcend through spiritual violence. The rioters reached into the grave with hands that did not tremble, dragging the skeletal remains out into the light of a day that held no reverence for his office. The bones of Tomas Torquemada were dragged across the same stone floors where his retinue of 200 horsemen had once clattered in a show of absolute power. He was no longer a figure of divine mandate, but a collection of grey ash and fragile calcium, tossed from hand to hand like common refuse. The mob carried him out into the open air of the plaza, the very ground where his victims had once stood in their yellow tunics, waiting for the fire to consume them. The irony of the moment was not lost on the watchers. The hunter had finally become the prey, and the judge was about to face a jury of the people he had spent his existence trying to suppress. A pile of rubbish and broken furniture was gathered in the center of the square, forming a crude and hasty pyre that mocked the grand structures of the 16th century auto de fe. The remains of the Grand Inquisitor were thrown onto the heap with a casual, insulting violence, his skull rolling across the wood like a discarded toy. A single torch was applied to the base, and the flames began to lick at the dry timber, rising with a sudden, savage intensity that mirrored the fires of the Inquisition. This was not a ceremony of faith, but an act of historical catharsis, a visceral attempt to burn away the memory of a man who had turned fire into a tool of the state. As the heat intensified, the crowd watched in a strange, hypnotic silence that recalled the terrified gatherings of Torquemada's own era. The bones cracked and splintered in the heat, the ancient marrow turning to smoke that rose into the Spanish sky, merging with the dust of the surrounding plains. The fire did not differentiate between the holy and the profane, consuming the architect of the Inquisition with the same indifferent hunger it had shown to the thousands he had sent to their deaths. In this moment, the cycle of violence reached its inevitable conclusion, turning the grand narrative of religious purification into a final, chaotic scene of street justice. When the fire eventually died down to a bed of glowing embers and grey soot, there was nothing left of the men who had once terrified kings and queens. The rioters took the ash and the small, charred fragments of bone, and they scattered them into the wind that blew across the rugged landscape of Castile. They wanted no monument to remain, no place where his followers could gather, and no physical evidence that he had ever occupied the earth. The Grand Inquisitor's dream of eternal purity had resulted in his own absolute erasure, his identity dissolving into the very elements he had once sought to control through the thread of the flame. The memory of his reign did not die with his bones, it became a heavy, suffocating layer of the Spanish national identity that would take centuries to unravel. For generations, his name remained a sword held over the heads of those who dared to think differently, a reminder that the eyes of the church were once everywhere. Yet, the very terror he established began to rot the kingdom from within, leading to a long decline that his successors could not halt. The gold of the Americas flowed through a country that had become a fortress of the mind, stagnant and suspicious of the progress that was transforming the rest of the vibrant world. Today, the wind still carries the dust of the Castilian plains over the empty site where his tomb once stood, a place of silence and profound historical weight. There are no grand statues to commemorate his deeds, and no holy days celebrate the men who thought he was saving the soul of Spain. Instead, his name has become a synonym for the darkest impulses of the human heart, a warning of what happens when faith is stripped of mercy and replaced by the cold logic of the executioner. The man who slept on bare boards and ate only bread is remembered not for his piety, but for the blood that continues to stain the pages of history he wrote in fire. The legacy of Torquemada is found not in the stone of the monasteries but in the scars left on the collective consciousness of a people who learned to fear their own neighbors. His pursuit of a perfect, unified faith created a landscape of broken lives and scattered families, a debt that history has never truly been able to settle. As the sun sets over the spires of Avila, the long shadows remind the world that the darkness of the Inquisition was not just a period of time, but a manifestation of a fundamental human capacity for cruelty. The fire he lit was eventually turned upon him, leaving only the bitter, cold ash of a vision that consumed itself in the end. In the final accounting of his life, the Grand Inquisitor achieved the absolute silence he always sought, but it was the silence of condemnation rather than the peace of God. The theater of horror he constructed in the plazas of Spain remains a chilling reminder that the pursuit of purity often leads to the most impure of crimes. His story ends not with a divine trumpet, but with the sound of a mob and the crackle of a common bonfire, a final, screaming irony for a man who believed himself to be the hand of the Almighty. The ash is gone, the tomb is empty, and the name of Tomas Torquemada remains a curse that echoes through the corridors of time. Looking back across the 5 centuries that have passed since his death, the image of the man in the hair shirt remains fixed in the mind of the world. He is the eternal judge, the sleepless guardian, and the merciless purifier who forgot that he was made of the same mortal clay as those he condemned. The tragedy of his existence lies in the fact that he truly believed his cruelty was an expression of love, a delusion that turned a nation into a graveyard. As the light of reason continues to shine on the dark corners of his era, the Grand Inquisitor stands as the ultimate symbol of a faith that lost its way in the pursuit of absolute, terrifying power. The final image of this history is not the grand auto-da-fe or the royal court, but the fine, grey dust settling on the dry grass outside the walls of Avila. It is a humble and silent ending for a man who dominated his age with the roar of the fire and the weight of the iron. The wind does not care for the pedigree of the ash it carries, nor does the earth remember the titles of the bones it once held. In the end, the man who wanted to cleanse the world was himself cleansed by the very forces of history he tried so desperately to halt. The story of Torquemada is a circle of fire that finally closed upon its creator, leaving behind only the cold, unyielding silence of the stone. The monastery of St. Thomas stands as a hollow shell of its former power, its cloisters haunted by the memory of the clanking sabers and the scent of the unicorn horn. The tourists who walk its halls today do not feel the presence of a saint, but the lingering chill of a man whose devotion was a form of war. They look at the empty space in the floor and see the ultimate failure of fanatical ambition, a void that speaks louder than any sermon. The fire of the 19th century did what the laws of the 15th could not. It provided a final judgment on a man who had presumed to judge the world in the name of the eternal. This is the finality of the Grand Inquisitor, a man who sought the heights of heaven and found only the common ash of the street. His obsession with blood and fire created a mirror that eventually reflected his own image back at him in the most brutal of ways. The people of Spain walked the same streets where the yellow tunics once marched, their lives no longer dictated by the fear of the secret word or the midnight knock. Torquemada's theater of horror has closed its doors forever, leaving the stage to the winds of time and the quiet, persistent light of a world that has chosen to remember his crimes so that they might never be repeated.